My name is Alexei Goncharov. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Australia-Russia Dialogue, and I will be facilitating our session today. Before concentrating on the Australia-Russia Dialogue, in my earlier career, I worked as a geoscientist. I'm a geophysicist by my education, so I know something about petroleum and gas, but not too much, certainly not so much about the production and trade of those products. So please don't be surprised if I ask stupid questions or make stupid comments. Very warm welcome to all of you here in the room in St. Petersburg. Very warm welcome to our partners in Australia. We fully appreciate that it's not morning, but in fact it's rather late in the day in some parts of Australia. So thank you very much, dear Australian participants, for making yourself available. I also wanted to say that I'm very sorry that our Australian participants could not be here physically this year because of the COVID travel restrictions, but we hope, the RD committee hopes, that next year situation will change and we will be able to see Australian participants of this wonderful International Gas Forum live. Also, very warm welcome to those people who are listening to our broadcast via YouTube channel. And finally, thank you very much to the organizing committee for helping Australia-Russia Dialogue make this happen. The plan is that our speakers will have probably 5 minutes, maximum 7 minutes for their presentation, and I will probably allow then one brief question from the floor. And the idea is that if we follow this timeline, then we may have some time left at the end for a general discussion and additional questions. And final comment which I want before we start is that we titled this event as the Australia-Russia Hydrogen / LNG Dialogue, but after some discussions in the RD committee, we decided that probably the name dialogue was probably too ambitious, excessively ambitious for the current situation. It probably should be called overture or expectation of a dialogue. And we hope that our meeting today will gain momentum and maybe even become regular in not too distant future. Now, we'll listen to our first speaker. Krista Visser is president of the Australia-Russia Dialogue and also the senior vice president responsible for global origination at DRA Global. Welcome, Krista.
Спасибо, Alexei.
Thank you, Alexei.
Добрый день, коллеги. So can I just start off by thanking everybody for their attendance to this session that's being sponsored and hosted by the Australia-Russia Dialogue. I would like to acknowledge all the participants from all over the world that have dialed into this session this morning in St. Petersburg. As Alexei mentioned, that most of us would have loved to have been in St. Petersburg. I myself only returned from Russia at the end of August. I spent June and July this year actually in Russia, so I was fortunate enough to be able to travel overseas this year, even with COVID. But from an Australia-Russia Dialogue point of view, our main aim is to promote trade and investment, knowledge sharing and collaboration between Australia and Russia. We are a non-political organization, so we are there for the benefit of our members, mostly the economic benefit. We serve a broad range of members from the wine industry right through to the oil and gas industry, to the resources industry that I'm mostly associated with. So we try and provide that kind of dialogue between Australia and Russia. We have regular meetings with the Australian government and regular meetings with the Russian government in Australia to see how we can assist this collaboration between two countries, especially in our view in terms of oil and gas or the oil and gas sector. We are both pretty large producers of oil and gas in our own right. I mean, Russia is by far much larger than Australia, but we think there are lots of lessons to learn from each other. DRA that I work for, as Alexei mentioned, we're proud to have an office in Russia. We do provide professional services to the resources industry across Russia. My expectation of this session today, and this is from our workings with our Russian colleagues over the last 4 years since I've done an extensive amount of travel to Russia, is that every time we engage with Russian clients, with Russian colleagues, we challenge each other. We are provocative in our thoughts. We want to learn from each other. And I think over the years, we've built very good relationships with our customers in Russia. We've built very good relationships and become friends with some people in our customer organizations. So if you ask me, what do I want to see out of this session today? I believe that, by challenging each other, by asking provocative questions, by really setting high expectations, setting high market expectations, raising the bar, that we will have a very fruitful, a very robust session. And I look forward to myself learning a lot more about the oil and gas industry, being more so in the resources industry. But thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to a very interesting session.
Thank you very much, Christo, for your introduction. Just of general interest, because this question was asked to me several times yesterday, what's the current situation with the COVID in Australia, and from your point of view, how the economy is recovering, if it is recovering?
Thank you, Alexei. Look, like I said, we are apolitical, but we do have a view, and we do see what's happening in Australia. I think, reflecting back on my trip to Russia, in the middle of the year, we kind of experience both countries, maybe still in Russia, but at that stage in Australia, a very low voluntary vaccination rate. Since then, and upon my return, obviously, I think it's well known that, we've had a significant wave of the Delta variant going through New South Wales, which is our biggest state, which is the economic powerhouse of Australia from a global point of view, and subsequent to that, also to Victoria, and a little bit in our capital territory. So with, more than half of Australia's population in lockdown for the last 3 months, I think we've seen a significant increase in people getting vaccinated. I think we are very close to 80% vaccination in New South Wales. The strict quarantine measures are still in place in many states, but the first state that has indicated, significant relaxation and a resumption of international travel has been New South Wales, where Victoria's hotel quarantine situation will probably come to an end, and people will be able to home quarantine for 7 days. That will allow an enormous amount of travel between Australia and other countries. I think from a business point of view, there are lots of businessmen out there yearning to go and see their customers in other parts of the world. But also Australia need to, high demand or high reliance actually on tourism. So it would be good to see the tourism industry getting reactivated, and a lot of tourists come back to Australia like they did in the past. So look, economically, Australia's got a very robust economy. I think, again, Russia, similar to Australia, are very rich in natural resources. And I think Russia, similar to Australia, if I can say, has probably benefited to an extent through a very robust demand and a demand cycle for natural resources over the COVID period. I think if you look at it from an industry point of view, I think the resources industry in general in Australia and many other parts of the world where we have offices, we've actually noticed a growth in the resources industry, a growth in our expenditure of our clients. We're already getting into a demand cycle in terms of our labour, where we are struggling to get sufficient engineers to go and work on projects. So I think it's very promising for the resources industry.
Thank you very much, Christo. Does anybody have a quick question for Christo? No. All right. Thank you very much, Christo. Our next speaker is Andrew McInville. Andrew McInville is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association, APA. In my view, this is a very influential lobby in Australia, which talks to the federal government and government of states and territories on the regular basis and promotes interests of Australian petroleum companies in a kind of centralized fashion. We had many, I mean Australia-Russia dialogue, we had many interactions with APA before. In fact, all Russian participants of the Australian petroleum events came to Australia and gave their presentation with a great assistance from the APA. I wanted to ask you, Andrew, to, of course, share your views on the topic of today's discussion. But first, maybe you could start with a brief description of what APA is, because as far as I understand, there is no equivalent organization in Russia. And more specifically, is there any chance in the near future or not too near future that Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association will be renamed into the Australian Hydrogen Production Association? Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Alex. Very, very great pleasure to be here. No, I don't think that APA will become the Australian Hydrogen Association anytime soon, but I do think it highlights the importance of the broader challenge of decarbonising energy and what the future of energy is. And so with a brief bit of time available today, that's perhaps what I want to talk about is what's APA's role. And as you mentioned, Alexei, we are an advocacy organisation, and our focus is really on creating a policy environment that will support the safe and responsible development of resources here in Australia. And as part of that work, we're increasingly focused on how to decarbonise oil and natural gas whilst meeting a growing regional demand. So it's this challenge of increasing demand and reducing emissions at the same time. And what can that policy environment look like? APA, we represent about 55 upstream oil and gas producing companies, many of whom are already exploring and investing into things like carbon capture and storage and early stage hydrogen investments, but also very much signed up to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So a lot of APA's members have pathways to reach that target of net zero by 2050 through decarbonising energy, and already the industry is investing hundreds of millions of dollars to do so. I think as I look at the energy environment here in Australia and across the region where we send about $55 billion of exports, I think energy investments will increasingly focus on hydrogen, but hydrogen in conjunction with carbon capture and storage, because I think the two together for Australia are critical to decarbonising our energy supply here in Australia and into the region. And keeping in mind that natural gas is a very important feedstock for a number of very major industries here in Australia. And if we look at the global demand equation that we see around about hydrogen combined with CCS, a demand of around about 560 million tonnes by 2050. So what's happening here in Australia? Well, the Australian government has a national hydrogen strategy that was released 2 years ago, and that sets out that it could be around about an $11 billion annual industry and as high as $26 billion in a high growth scenario for hydrogen here in Australia. In addition to that strategy, in 2019, in April this year, the Australian government announced around 540 million Australian dollars of investment in funding for new hydrogen hubs and for carbon capture and storage programs. In addition to that $540 million, there was about another $560 million for strategic international partnerships on low emissions technology. So the Australian government is very committed, and as are we at APIA, to driving that policy environment. Our focus is really on making sure that the policy environment works well. So when we look at what a good regulatory and legal framework might look like, we're encouraging the government to explore options around financing of hydrogen supply chains, attracting private investment into those supply chains. We focus on how can we look to extend exploration and geoscience activity to include carbon capture sites, so not only in, let's call it old gas fields, but specific dedicated new carbon capture sites for which Australia's geology is very good. How to build widespread demand for hydrogen, particularly in the heavy transport industry, which is going to be very important here in Australia, and of course as an industrial feedstock. I think the government and our industry has an important role in also ensuring community confidence in CCS and hydrogen. Very importantly, what we've been encouraging the government to do is to look at how we can further support hydrogen combined with CCS as part of the broader government policy framework around emissions reduction. And just last week, we saw that the government has allowed carbon capture and storage here in Australia to be included under what's called the Emissions Reduction Fund. And that's very important because it provides a financial incentive for carbon and hydrogen development as we move forward. Our overarching message to government, and I think it's an important one as we consider today, is that market systems are very important to encourage the sort of innovation and investment needed to support the further development of the hydrogen industry here in Australia. And for us, we talk about hydrogen combined with CCS, and certainly our experience in building an LNG industry from scratch here in Australia, we would argue, and we do argue to the government, that we have the right technology expertise and trade relationships to make that industry of CCS combined with hydrogen exports as a reality for us in Australia. And finally, just two other points. A quick comment about the economics of hydrogen, which again we spend a lot of time talking to the government about, but our very firm view is that hydrogen combined with CCS is probably the most viable pathway to decarbonising energy, and particularly while we've got very high demand for energy security here in the Asia-Pacific region. If we look at the cost competitiveness of hydrogen, blue hydrogen with CCS, we see that that's really, at the moment, far more competitive compared to renewable hydrogen produced with electrolyzers. And we would expect that to probably continue to be the case over the next decade. But I just conclude by saying, Alexei, that when we look at the development of future energy here in Australia, the role of CCS, the role of hydrogen, one of the very strong messages we're delivering to our government is that we shouldn't be talking about blue hydrogen versus green hydrogen versus grey hydrogen. We've got to move forward with all of those. And really, when we talk about hydrogen and a future energy opportunity in Australia, that should be really defined by its emissions footprint rather than any particular production method. And government here in Australia, we're very much encouraging them to give equal weight to all sorts of hydrogen production systems. And the real focus, and our real focus here at APIA, is on reducing emissions related to the production of energy. So as a policy organisation, that's where we play, Alexei. So hopefully that sets up the discussion from our panel of experts that come in behind me. But thank you, Alexei.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Do we have any questions? Sergey, yes, please go ahead.
Я задам вопрос на русском. I will ask the question in Russian. My name is Sergei Kapitonov from Skolkovo. Andrew, thank you very much for such a deep explanation of oil and gas industry of Australia. We see that such issues as CCS and hydrogen play a crucial role in the energy strategy of Russia. My question is as follows. It's about the traditional aspect as LNG. We know that there's a group of LNG exporting countries, and Australia was ranked first among such exporting countries. But in the society, there are some questions regarding the construction of import units for LNG. So do you think that small tonnage LNG for some niche markets are required for Australia? What is your opinion about it?
Question, and I do believe that we will see the emergence of LNG import terminals here in Australia. I think the market will dictate that. We're already seeing some investment on the East Coast, and I do think that reflects the natural cycle of the market. We as APIA continue to encourage domestic production of gas, obviously, but where the big population centres are in Australia, in Sydney and in Melbourne, versus where the new predominance of gas production is coming from, it will make economic sense that we will see LNG import terminals in Australia. And that's a policy challenge for the government because people don't understand that that's very natural and normal in a market. But I fully expect that the economics of LNG import terminals, probably a couple, will stack up here in Australia, yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Sergei. Thank you, Andrew. Any other questions? No. All right. In that case, our next speaker is Peter Moore. Peter Moore currently is a non-executive director of several petroleum companies in Australia, and also an adjunct professor at Curtin University and chair of Curtin's Faculty of Science and Engineering Advisory Council. Early in his career, Peter led Woodside's global exploration efforts as executive vice president for exploration, and he was involved in numerous hydrocarbon discoveries throughout Australia and overseas, with the most famous being the giant Pluto gas discovery that resulted in a $15 billion LNG development at the giant Caliance discovery that will underpin the planned floating LNG development of Woodside's Browse fields. For those of you who participated in the general LNG session yesterday, you will know a little bit more. You already know a little bit more about that Browse field and some plans about its development in the near or not so near future. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. Just following on from Andrew, I think I'd like to talk more broadly about hydrogen. I'll say a few words about LNG and its relationship to hydrogen and natural gas and all of their roles in decarbonising our world. For this audience, I'd also like to make specific reference to some Australian examples. So we all know globally over 80% of our energy today comes from fossil fuels. Some of the fossil energy is used directly, and some goes into making electricity. Indeed, about 43% of the energy we use globally is consumed via electricity. And we know also that as a starting point for emissions reduction, we need to decarbonise our electricity production. And we can do a lot of that with renewables and hydro and nuclear. But we just can't run everything on electricity. So if we want to decarbonise heavy transport, shipping, industries requiring intense heat, such as steel making, we need to have a clean fuel that's very energy dense, that can be stored and transported. So green hydrogen produced using renewable energy via electrolysis is one major source that's seen to meet some of these needs. But there are three challenges that I see: cost of production, supply chain inadequacies, and customer demand. Most analysts believe these problems will be solved. It will just take time. So in Australia, the production cost target that the government has set is clean hydrogen for $2 a kilogram. On an energy equivalent basis, that equates to about $16 a gigajoule. So it's still relatively expensive compared to natural gas, which typically sells in Australia under contract for between $5 and $10 a gigajoule, depending on where you are in the country. At present, grey hydrogen can often be made using natural gas for just $1 or $2 a kilogram, so there's a big gap. If CCS is added to make hydrogen blue, the commonly assumed uplift is about 50 cents a kilogram, so not too much extra expense. Of course, you need good CCS sites, and in this regard, Australia is pretty well endowed. For example, the Gorgon CCS facility offshore WA at 3.4 to 4 million tonnes per annum of storage is currently the largest in the world, while the Moomba project in Central Australia at 1.7 million tonnes per annum is also world scale. Getting to green hydrogen, however, is a longer-term proposition due to several challenges. First, the cost of production needs to come down from its current $5 to $6 a kilogram on average. Secondly, the electricity input needs to be green, which isn't the case for most grid electricity today, including Australia's. Indeed, if we were just to replace the hydrogen that's currently produced by gas and coal with green hydrogen made from renewables, it would consume about 11% of the world's total supply of renewable energy as it's available today. The solution has to lie with new hydrogen production in multi-source renewable energy hubs which produce cheap, clean electricity throughout the day and evening to maximise electrolyser running times. By locating hydrogen manufacturing in renewable energy zones together with industrial customers, transport and storage costs can also be minimised. And with the passage of time, we do expect a significant decline in the cost of electrolysers as they become more common, more efficient and standardised. In Australia, we are developing a suite of renewable energy zones with $1.2 billion of federal government support to grow a hydrogen industry. If all planned projects are developed, electrolysis capability in Australia is said to be able to grow to 20 gigawatts by 2030. And Australia is, of course, seen as one of the best places in the world to produce green hydrogen due to its abundance of land, sunshine, and wind. We also have the advantage of a green electricity grid in the island state of Tasmania due to an abundance of hydropower there. And several companies, including Woodside here, Fortescue and Origin, are planning green hydrogen and ammonia manufacture in Tasmania at the industrial port complex of Bell Bay. The next challenge, however, is getting the hydrogen to market and indeed growing a market. At present, the market for using hydrogen as a fuel is tiny. In Australia, we are taking a series of modest steps to start growing the market. For example, we've started blending hydrogen in our domestic gas supply in a few areas and have purchased our first hydrogen vehicles. In Victoria, there's a project underway that's making hydrogen using brown coal, then liquefying it for shipment to Japan in a new, world-first liquid hydrogen tanker. If this pilot's successful, we'll then geosequester the produced CO2 offshore. Elsewhere in Australia, global fertiliser manufacturers like Yara are making blue hydrogen and blending with their existing production to lower its emissions levels. Large Australian iron ore miners of BHP have committed to net zero emissions by 2050, including Scope 3, while Fortescue Metals has gone one step further by targeting net zero, including Scope 3, by 2040. And to help with this, Fortescue are working on concepts for green steel and ammonia fuel ship engines. And Fortescue's subsidiary AIP has just received government support to build a new gas-fired power plant that they plan to run on 50% hydrogen from day one and 100% hydrogen by 2030. Most Australian companies are working with our Asian partners to help develop their hydrogen economy with a focus on transport. The giant South Korean steel giant POSCO, for example, is looking to Australia to help supply 5 million tonnes per annum of low-carbon hydrogen that it needs by 2050. And Korea Zinc, the world's largest zinc producer, is very interested in looking at Australia to help supply 5 million tonnes of hydrogen for the same decarbonisation reasons. Now, due to the small size of Australia's population and domestic economy, exports will be needed and are being planned to fully develop our hydrogen economy. To do this, the focus is turning towards using ammonia as a transport medium, since it's cheaper to produce, handle and ship than liquid hydrogen. While the costs of conversion might add up to maybe $1 a kilogram, maybe half of this can be avoided if the ammonia can be used directly. So hence there's intense interest in cooperation with companies that are designing engines that can run directly on 100% ammonia, especially for shipping. In summary, while the future has many challenges for hydrogen, there are visible solutions to most of these challenges. It will just take quite a bit of time to get there. And this, I think, is where the role of blue hydrogen comes in. As a currently available, cheaper alternative to green hydrogen, it has the potential to firstly enable the development of a hydrogen economy, then accelerate and support it, working as a partner alongside green hydrogen as it develops and gradually becomes cheaper and more abundant. Of course, there's currently a hot debate around the emissions intensity of blue hydrogen, which will need time and more research to resolve. This also brings up the topic of emission offsets and their role going forward. The consensus is to get to net zero, we'll need to use all of the tools in our toolkit, including carbon capture and storage, plus offsets for those difficult to decarbonise activities. As we transition, it's assumed we'll actually grow our use of gas for a while, both as a replacement for coal and as a source of blue hydrogen. The growth is expected to be most pronounced in the expanding Asian economies and for use as LNG. However, to continue to use natural gas, customers are going to have to consider how to reduce their carbon emissions, and some of this will flow back to the exporting countries. For example, Australian companies are already making some shipments of net zero carbon LNG to Asia, with the additional cost of the carbon offsets presumably split between seller, buyer and the ultimate customer. So while the energy transition is upon us, it will take decades to progress, and during that time natural gas will remain important and indeed continue to grow for the next decade or more. However, the way we think about natural gas will change, with an increased focus on finding and developing low CO2 gas, reducing CO2 emissions from our operations by reducing flaring, venting and methane leakage, developing CCS facilities with very high levels of CO2 capture, then offsetting remaining emissions, and by increasingly using gas with CCS to make blue hydrogen. And I think with those comments, I'll stop for any questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you. Any questions to Peter? Yes, please. Please introduce yourself.
Да, можно и на русском, да, вопрос?
I would like to ask one question in Russian. Could you please tell me the following? In Australia, my name is Mr. Voronov, and I'm the representative of LNG Association, and I'm the head of hydrogen energy at ITMA University. Russia, just like Australia, is a big exporter of renewable sources of energy. Today we are talking about LNG and hydrogen. Australia sets plans to produce LNG. We know that you can create gas out of coal. Even this technology is available. So my question is about hydrogen, not only green hydrogen, but turquoise hydrogen, as we say. So at one of the European dialogues, they did not speak about turquoise hydrogen. They didn't want to have a look at it, but the carbon footprint is quite small. You get some hard products, solid products. You spoke about carbon capture storage technology. So if you take them, then it's about the storage of hydrogen and not the storage of CO2. And in our case, I would like to go back once again to methane pyrolysis. We get a highly qualitative product from the point of view of Asian demand. Do you consider this type of import for Asian countries, for Japan? Perhaps you have some long-term plans. I know that there are some tensions with the Asian countries, but do you consider the export of products like turquoise hydrogen? Maybe we should use some other terms, not colors. Non-carbon hydrogen doesn't exist, and even green hydrogen has some carbon footprint. Would you like to continue the export of hydrogen? And you know that hydrogen is a product that you receive, but do you want to export derivatives from natural gas?
Yeah, look, in terms of that question, I think other people will also be able to answer it. But generally, the feeling is that Asia needs gas in order to decarbonize its system. Certainly, countries like India won't go directly from coal straight through to renewables. They will move through gas in the process. And so just the export of normal gas, natural gas, will be continue to be popular and needed and grow. Clearly, though, we need to decarbonise our system. And in the process of doing that, we will be looking at multiple techniques. One clearly is to reduce our carbon emissions from our LNG. So already in several projects in Australia, we are required going forward with new projects to capture the reservoir CO2 and sequester it. Where CO2 is not being captured, we will more and more be doing offsets. And to give you an example, shipments going out from Origin Energy, I know they were paying about $10 a tonne to offset, and they're offsetting all the way through to Scope 3. So paying probably about $2.5 million a shipment in order to offset those remaining CO2 emissions. The third thing, though, of course, with Australia is to avoid that whole process, either then start shipping other products that people want, very decarbonised products like hydrogen, or more likely to be shipped is ammonia. And those products, if they're made with hydrogen with CCS or blue hydrogen, that's one way. And the other way, when we can bring the cost down, we'll be shipping out green hydrogen. And that will be done either directly as a liquid or, I think, more likely through shipping ammonia. At the other end, they will either use the ammonia directly if they can build suitable engines and burn it, or they will convert it back to hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Peter. I don't think that we have All right. Well, if you could please be very quick. One more question from the floor. Please introduce, пожалуйста, представьтесь.
Rochkin Igor, National LNG Association. Thank you very much for all the statistics that you have outlined when it comes to the production costs and the possible consumption costs. Unfortunately, you said nothing about the transportation cost, but we are all well aware of the fact that Australia, as a leading LNG production technology country, is also engaged in the production of LNG technologies, is also partner with the US, Japan, and other states. So my question is, have you studied the transportation cost of hydrogen being transported from Australia to Europe, to Japan? What the cost is expected to be? I expect you are going to use tankers from your fleet. So what are the prospects, to your mind, for these transportation costs? Thank you.
Again, I think the individual companies that are represented here might want to better address that. The statistics that I've seen from major organisations globally tend to look at trying to ship ammonia, and shipment from Australia to Japan, from recollection, was again in about the $1 a kilogram price range. But there'll be other people who'll be able to give more accurate figures than that, I would suspect, on this call. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't think that we have time for any further questions to Peter, but if we have some time left at the end of our session, maybe you will be able to ask additional questions in the end. Our next speaker is George Gilboy. George is the Vice President and Chief Representative Japan at Woodside Energy. Woodside Energy, for those of you who do not know, is Australia's leading natural gas producer. Woodside led the development of LNG industry in Australia, and they are an important part of Australia's energy transformation. Also, as far as I understand, as far as I'm aware, from 2005 to 2013, George was Woodside's chief representative in China and actually lived in Beijing. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone for the opportunity to be here with you today. Yes, I am currently Woodside's chief representative in Japan. Prior to that, I was our company's chief economist, and prior to that, about 20 years in China. Now, I've been asked to comment on several questions. They cover quite a wide range of topics, but of all my comments is that Woodside in the energy transition by providing reliable, cost-competitive, lower carbon energy now, and we are developing new capabilities for carbon management, new fuels such as ammonia and hydrogen, and we're aligned with a net zero carbon aspiration by 2050. So the first topic I was asked to comment on was Woodside and the post-COVID recovery. I think here the main point I'd like to, of course it's a wide topic, I'll just focus on one element that's quite current. Woodside, we are very pleased to see recovery in the global economy, but we're also concerned about the potential effects of recent high spot prices for natural gas. We of course intend to remain a safe and a reliable long-term supplier of LNG, but I think this highlights in the LNG market the value of term contracts for LNG. Recent years have seen a very large increase in the amount of short-term trade in LNG, but term contracts also have their role to help manage market cycles and protect against extreme price movements like what we're seeing right now. And for our part, Woodside is able to match contracted LNG with the flexibility that customers need to manage demand. So that's, I think, something about the recovery that's an important point, that in the LNG business, it still remains the case that suppliers and customers need to take a long-term view. Now, we've had a number of other important developments as the world is recovering from the pandemic. Our board has recently appointed Meg O'Neill as our CEO, only the 6th CEO in our company's history. And we've also announced a proposed merger with the BHP petroleum business. That proposed
sorry to interrupt, George. Is Meg now a proper CEO, not acting role anymore, is it?
She is permanent CEO. That was announced in August. Yes.
Oh, I missed that. Thank you very much. Sorry, I interrupted.
You're welcome. Well, we're very, very, very pleased by that, and I think, yeah, thank you. Now, of course, the other big news for our company around that same time was the announcement of the proposed merger with the BHP petroleum business. That proposed merger is subject to some final documents being agreed for the transaction, and it must receive the necessary approvals. But that is targeted for the second quarter of next year, 2022, for completion. And with that, Woodside would become a top 10 global independent energy company. It would double our production and offer many growth opportunities, including both in LNG and also for new fuels, such as I mentioned, ammonia and hydrogen. Now, the second area that I was asked to comment on was Scarborough and an update on the Scarborough project. As some of you may know, Scarborough is a 13 TCF low CO2 gas field offshore Western Australia. We are targeting final investment for that this year, before the end of this year, and also to develop that gas through a second train at the Pluto LNG project. That'll allow full utilization from Scarborough of the 8 MTPA offshore capacity, and the first cargo is targeted for 2026, at a time when we believe that the market will need and have quite robust demand for LNG. We've also launched a sell down process for Scarborough and Pluto Train 2. We're targeting a sell down of up to 49% in Train 2, and we're testing the market for opportunities regarding our equity interests. Woodside currently has 73.5% of Scarborough and 100. Now, the third topic I was asked to comment on was synergies between the natural gas business and hydrogen, and what's our strategy there. We believe that hydrogen has the potential to play a key role in meeting global demand for safe and clean and affordable and reliable energy. And we also believe that hydrogen is a natural evolution of our energy export business model post 2030, roughly. Okay. I haven't met Andrew McConville personally yet, but I certainly found his remarks on this topic to be valuable. So from Woodside, our principles of work in hydrogen are three, really: that it must be customer-led, and that is really the focus of some of our work right now, developing contacts with customers and partners. We are technology agnostic, so I think again, we believe that blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, all the technologies need to be tested. We're technology agnostic. And we do believe that lowest cost is a really critical principle, I think, as everyone can appreciate, to get a market started. So what has Woodside been doing in this area? Well, in Japan, where I am based, we've been participating with Japanese partners in multiple Japanese government-sponsored technical feasibility studies to assess production technologies and also the supply chain. We're already looking at potential developments in Australia. We're also a partner in the hydrogen network, called HyNet, which is a consortium in South Korea that already has 8 hydrogen refueling stations operational. Carbon management is going to be a critical capability for all of this. And we have already developed our in-house business for assessing and purchasing voluntary market units or offsets in normal language. We've also have a dedicated CCS team, and carbon capture and storage is going to present an opportunity, although and as Peter mentioned, Australia is very well endowed here, but with the potential for CCS, but it does, as Peter also noted, still have some challenges. Our company has set our own targets for decarbonization. So we have a baseline scope 1 and 2 emissions from 2016 to 2020 that we compare to. And very importantly, we've set near-term targets. So we want to be 15% below that baseline by 2025 and 30% below that baseline by 2030 with our 2050 aspiration. I sense that I'm probably running up against time, but I just want to conclude, the last point that I was asked to address was the role of gas in the low carbon future. And I think I fully agree with the earlier speakers that natural gas is going to play an essential role in getting us to that low carbon future in a reliable, safe, and economically and socially sustainable way. We certainly can be seeing natural gas and LNG to firm up renewable energy resources. And also, of course, there are hard to abate sectors that I think Peter mentioned. So we do believe that there's quite an important continued future for natural gas and the new capabilities for fuels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. Any questions to George? Yes, Vladimir, please go ahead.
Добрый день, Джордж. Воронов, Владимир.
Good afternoon, George. Voronov, National LNG Association. I believe you have also been following the latest events when we see that the price for 1 billion cubic meters is over $1,450. And here is my question. So you mentioned the transitional features of natural gas. Yes, we have been talking about it, but we understand that this transition period might last for quite a while. So such a high price, even for today, so we understand that it won't last long. Is it a driver for transition to hydrogen, or perhaps the other way around? Perhaps it stops us from moving faster to the hydrogen economy. What do you think?
Yeah, there is no, thank you for that question. There is no one single answer to that question, of course. I do think that some people are quite concerned that very high prices for natural gas can destroy demand for natural gas. Of course, my experience has been in this industry, having gone through several of the LNG market cycles, that these expected to be relatively short-term periods of very high prices are the signal that ultimately brings on additional investment and supply. As I alluded to, traditionally, and unfortunately, customers and suppliers have difficulty if there's adequate supply for times when it will influence the recent high prices. It's not simply a question of investment cycles. But overall, I think you noted some important risks in your question. But I also still think that there's quite a long-term role for LNG, I think, as a very flexible source of natural gas supply, and with contract terms and flexibilities that will allow it to continue to play a role to meet demand and to support the development in a stable way, of these other technologies that we're looking at.
Thank you very much, George. One question came through this request for questions, which I emailed to all people who were invited and probably, hopefully, are listening to us via the YouTube broadcast. The question was, why Woodside, unlike Total, CNPC, China National Petroleum Company, I think, and Silk Road Fund, have not yet invested in any Russian LNG projects, and what needs to be done on Russian side for Woodside's approach to investment in Russia to change?
I'm very sorry, but I cannot hear this question. Did any...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
The question from one of the people who are hopefully watching us via YouTube broadcast. Why Woodside, unlike CNPC, Total, and Silk Road Fund, have not yet invested in any Russian LNG projects, and what needs to be done on Russian side for Woodside's approach to investment in Russia to change? Easy, isn't it?
Yeah, I have to say that yes, thank you very much for the question, and I appreciate the scope and also the intent of the question. So thank you very much for that. Look, of course, big projects are always quite difficult and complicated. I think perhaps it's true that that there hasn't been that investment yet. But I can say that, for example, in the recent past, Woodside had no real business with Russian LNG producers. And in the last 18 months, we've purchased 3 LNG cargoes from Russian producers, 2 in the Atlantic Basin and 1 in Asia. So I think incremental steps towards building things
Sorry
up.
to interrupt, George. Sorry to interrupt. Did anybody know this, Sergey?
Yeah.
Are you aware of this? All right, so I'm ignorant in that regard. Apparently there are people in the room, including Sergey Kapitonov right next to me, who are aware of that latest development. But yeah, please continue, George.
Yeah, yes, well, I think the concluding remark is simple that, there are opportunities in the short-term LNG market as well, and I think we're already beginning to explore some of those. And who knows, perhaps someday on the bigger questions that require much more complex and involved discussions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, George. Thank you. Our next speaker is Sergey Kapitonov. Sergey Kapitonov is the gas analyst at the Scarborough Energy Center, and his spheres of interest include competition between pipeline gas and LNG, also natural gas pricing mechanisms on global markets, and European energy transition and alternative fuels in transportation sector. Welcome, Sergey.
Thank you very much, Alexei. I thank our Australian partners for organizing this dialogue. As Alexei said, I wish today's event to be this introduction to the large-scale commercial dialogue between our states. Today, I wanted to show you a rather complex presentation with all the slides, but given that we have such a friendly ambience here, I decided just to share my view on Russia-Australian cooperation in a number of areas. First of all, in terms of long-term forecast, I must say that Russia and Australia, as big gas producers, the demand is expected to grow, especially in the Asian Pacific region, in the APR coming from China. We expect that there will be a twofold growth for gas from China. For gas demand. Then we have Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India, where we expect to have a 70% growth in the coming 20 years. And finally, South Asian states like Thailand, we also expect the growth by 60% in the coming 20 years. The APR is the region where the interests of Australia and Russia meet. Russia, Australia as a long-standing LNG exporter and Russia as a newcomer to the market. Apparently, it all triggers new opportunities. It brings forward new opportunities for cooperation. Australia can organize experts to eastward and westward using pipeline gas and shipments. Of course, here we see beautiful opportunities for commercial projects, joint projects. What is wrong on the LNG market? They say if we have two tankers going through the Suez Canal, going to both directions and paying fees for that. So Russia and Australia are the countries that can roll out their products to the market. Alexei, 2 years ago, submitted an idea to organize such joint projects. And while analyzing our joint interests, we might see that these transactions are possible, are feasible, that commercial deals are there, that Russia might cover and engage the Asian market. Other avenues of cooperation.
Estimates to which you are referring, as we both know, they were made based on the Skolkovo analytics published in 2018. So I think it's time to refresh the numbers.
Спасибо за комментарий. Следующим.
Thank you for your comment.
Another aspect is technological aspect, and cooperation is required. Australia takes efforts to develop CCS technologies, hydrogen technologies. Here in Russia, the discussion about it has also started. Companies have implemented pilot projects in areas like methane pyrolysis and blue hydrogen. Gazprom is planning to develop them. And of course, we need carbon storages and carbon storage technologies, so we are looking forward for technological exchange between the countries. The third aspect of cooperation could be the following. You spoke about the export of carbon-neutral LNG export from Russia and other countries. So we spoke about even 3 different types of hydrogen like that. And so we could cooperate in areas like carbon credits, verification of carbon credits. We have also vast land and forest resources in Australia. There are a lot of forests too, so we could create some mechanisms for carbon neutral selling of LNG. The potential of cooperation is much bigger than I can cover within 5 minutes, so it could be great to meet once again at the platform of Australia-Russia LNG and hydrogen dialogue. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Any questions to Sergey?
У меня вопрос.
I have a question. And don't forget to introduce yourself. My name is Alexander Klementiev. I have a question to Sergey and to the speakers from Australia. It's clear that the potential of technological cooperation is there. But for Russia and Australia, we are competitors at the market of energy carriers. And it's not only about LNG, it's also about coal. The target markets in the East are the same for us. So with regard to the active trend of politicization of energy industry in the whole world, and I can give you an example of Russia and European Union, and problems of Gazprom company, Australia and China, and tensions in energy sector between the countries. So in this area, are we more competitors? And shall we use the upcoming opportunities in Russia to get new clients and enter new markets? Or do you think that there's a space for closer energy cooperation, for the implementation of projects with Australian capital here in Russia in order to preserve the balance and to keep the presence of Australian companies in Chinese market? Thank you. I would like to start answering your question. To my mind, unfortunately, everything that happens with the politicization of gas supply is quite a negative scenario for the future role of gas. When we have political labels and consumers start to think whether they should to have anything in common with a politicized commodity. So to my mind, cooperation and competition are things that do not exclude each other. Namely, we can see, for example, that there are some Russian LNG projects where French companies participate, and there are also large resource traders just like Novatek, and they could compete in the area of pipeline or LNG gas in the European market. So I believe that cooperation is better than absence of cooperation or simple competition in the target markets. You know that there are short-term arbitration opportunities. We can get some supplies from Australia. If we get Australian investment in Russia coming to LNG projects, that could be great, and that could balance the impact of Chinese partners. And you know that Chinese companies actively invest in the Russian Arctics, but in this regard, it's up to Australia to make the first step.
I think that competition and cooperation are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Dear Australian participants, does anybody want to add something to this part of our discussion?
Alexei, it's Andrew here. Look, I might just add one comment. I mean, I think what we are seeing, and this is the case in Australia and I'm sure elsewhere in the world, that the competition for capital into the sector is becoming greater. We are seeing some pressure on lenders to lend to the sector, whether it be debt or equity. And so I think there is opportunity to diversify that risk base by looking at investments in different broader markets. I think that is the case. I think it's also a matter of working with governments to help them understand that the market for capital to invest into the oil and gas sector is very much a global one, not a regional one. And I think that that's something that we can stress both in Australia and in countries like Russia, that in order to recognise the changing risk profile, we need to be able to make sure that capital can be accessed from a range of markets. And I think at times that's quite challenging.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. I don't think that we have time for any further questions, so we'll move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Roberto Aguilera. Roberto is an energy economist with Curtin University in Australia. Roberto is currently a member of the SPE Asia Pacific Regional Technical Advisory Committee, and in not too distant past, he was an analyst with the OPEC Secretariat in Vienna. Welcome, Roberto.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexei. Hello, everyone. I would like to right away share my screen where I have some PowerPoint slides loaded. So I hope you can see the title slide clearly now. And I'm showing these photos right away taken in 2019. That was before COVID, so no restrictions. But they show that the momentum behind an energy transition is happening all over the world, including in this very isolated city where we're located, Perth, Western Australia. This is part of the reason why hydrogen has become such a popular topic. So I want to show a slide about green hydrogen. We heard about the production costs earlier. Here they are summarized again, something like $25 to $50 per gigajoule, very high priced. But I'd add that typically the electricity coming from renewable like solar and wind represents some 2/3 of the total cost, with the electrolyzer accounting for the remaining third. It must be said, though, that these costs are coming down very quickly. Estimates say they could be half of this amount just within 5 years. Of course, if you're going to deliver the hydrogen somewhere else, you have to add a few dollars per kilogram to the total cost. I've heard a lot of debate about whether it's best to consume the hydrogen at the point of production or to send it close by via pipeline or truck, or to ship it as a liquid or with ammonia to distant places. I would say that each project would have to be assessed economically on a case-by-case basis because there are so many variables involved. Onto the blue hydrogen, where the costs in million or gigajoule are some 8 to 25 US dollars. And it starts to look more competitive there. Importantly, the price of the natural gas represents a significant share of the total cost. That means places with low-priced gas like Russia would have an advantage there. We heard earlier about hydrogen plans in Australia, including the National Hydrogen Strategy. Also, pretty much every state within the country has their own strategy. These are all freely available online. And we can see that Australia does have the potential to produce hydrogen in almost every color. Not the purple, I think it's called, for the nuclear-based, but brown hydrogen is there as well, doesn't get much attention. That's the coal-based hydrogen, where the CO2 byproduct is captured and stored underground. And I think Peter Moore mentioned a shipment of liquefied hydrogen. It'll be the first from Australia to Japan from the south of Australia, and that'll be coal-derived hydrogen. The Australian government has a plan to reduce the costs of green hydrogen to $2 per kilogram, Australian dollars, or less by 2030. I asked this consultancy, Rystad, if I could use the figure. They said, okay. So it shows the current costs per state in Australia and what's required to meet the ambitious goal of $2. So we can appreciate that it looks like a very difficult goal to achieve in the absence of some serious policy support in the form of subsidies. On to LNG now. And you'll be aware Australia became the #1 LNG exporter, surpassing Qatar. The USA was off of the chart around a decade ago, but now is #3 thanks to their unconventional shale gas revolution. And Russia is in there as well. Here we see a map showing the capacity in Australia. Most of the projects are located in the state of Western Australia, some also in the Northern Territory, and the rest in the eastern state of Queensland, where coal bed methane or coal seam gas is the gas that supplies the LNG. I would only add here that certainly lessons are being taken from the design and execution of LNG projects in the country over the past 15 years, where cost blowouts and delays sometimes occurred. So the lessons will be applicable to a hydrogen export industry. On the left-hand side here, we see that these three countries, Australia, Qatar, US, will likely compete for the top spot of LNG exporter in the rest of this decade. And on the right-hand side, we see capacity additions over the next 5 years. These are forecasts made, by the way, by an Australian government body. And neither Australia nor Russia experience much of a capacity addition, whereas the Qatar and US see major expansion over the next 5 years. I'm close to the end. This slide summarizes some of the linkages between hydrogen and the gas and LNG industries. In terms of the infrastructure, it was mentioned that hydrogen can be used in the gas pipelines. Our university, Curtin, is doing some research on blending 10 to 20% into gas pipelines. There's a company near Perth that's experimenting with 100% hydrogen delivery in its gas pipeline. Another point is about gas storage technologies, which may have application for hydrogen. This includes underground caverns and depleted hydrocarbon reservoirs. Then on the right-hand side, the LNG ships appear to be similar, but the biggest difference is a much colder temperature of liquefied hydrogen, therefore requiring expensive cryogenics technology. But certainly LNG shipping designs can be used for hydrogen ships. And I'll skip to the final point there, that's about economic market structures. Now, I believe that the distinct market structures and price forming mechanisms for natural gas around the world will serve as a model for hydrogen markets and pricing. So somewhat competitive in North America with many buyers and sellers, and more oligopolistic the way it was in Europe with just a few large sellers. And then in the Asia Pacific, it'll be like a bilateral monopoly where the large buyers and sellers negotiate a price directly. I finish with this slide showing a projection of the very long-term energy mix. Looks a bit science fiction-like. It goes to the year 2150. And these are just the fractional contributions of different resources. In this projection, methane, natural gas, reaches its maximum market share around mid-century. That allows for sufficient time to develop non-fossil sources like solar and wind. And hydrogen would be here too. It's not included in order to avoid double counting, as it can be produced from many of the resources shown in the figure, though of course it'll depend on technical policy and economic factors. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'll be glad to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Roberto, for a very informative presentation. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah. У меня вопрос. Да,
Yes, please, Sergey.
Александр Климин.
My name is Alexander Klementiev. I have a question to you. And my question goes like that. In the last slide, we could see that the share of coal and oil in the energy mix is 0. So what, according to your point of view, is the destiny of oil industry? Are there any new markets for oil products, or do you think that oil industry will be closed and all the scientific potential acquired and investments made will be simply abandoned? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I've long held the view in my research that the future of oil and gas in the energy mix will be important well into the 2030s, 40s, and 50s. In this figure, it's important to remember that these are just fractions of the total market. So even though you see the share of oil in decline, that doesn't refer to absolute levels of consumption in barrels. That continues to rise today and will continue to do so, I think, close to mid-century. And gas in particular has, of course, greater benefits because of its many advantages, its abundance, which we've talked about, its wide geographical distribution, its environmental benefits, at least compared with the other fossil fuels, and the fact that it can be used to produce hydrogen. In addition, I should say, oil and gas can be developed responsibly in combination with clean technologies like CCS, which has been mentioned, or with nature-based offsets, the planting of trees or seaweed or grasslands. There's a lot of excitement in that area in Australia. In addition, renewable projects are being used to power oil and gas operations, including the refrigeration of, or the liquefaction of the gas for LNG. And other clean technologies, well, I think that's it. That's my answer.
Thank you very much, Roberto. On a disciplinary note, I need to mention that at this point in time, we are like 8 minutes behind our ideal schedule, so I don't think I can allow any further questions to Roberto. And our next speaker is Alexander Klementiev, who is the advisor of the mission of the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, under the President of the Russian Federation, and also Alexander is a member of the Expert Council of the Russian Gas Society. Welcome, Alexander.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alexei. I asked a number of questions to the previous speakers, and the topic of my presentation is related to the processes of energy transition and our attitude and understanding of it. I would like to share my slides with you. Could you please show them on the screen, please? I came to the summary that energy transition is not this presentation, sorry, another one. Energy transition is not only about decarbonization as it is. So the history of energy transitions of the world shows that leaders can change, but other energy carriers used by humankind will remain, and the volume of their consumption will grow. That is related to oil, gas, and other sources. So energy transition in this regard is more a demonstration of the fact that the energy supply system becomes more complicated. And because of its complexity, it becomes more resilient. So in different regions of the world, they will have their own energy mix related to the needs of the customers. Then another question which I asked to Roberto, the destiny of coal, oil, and gas industry. What is going to happen with investments, jobs, and technologies acquired within the previous period of time? So the question is not only about energy. It's also about the opportunities of recycling and non-energy use of coal, oil, and gas, like the production of bioproteins or production of composite materials. And the third issue here is that climate change agenda pushes away other sustainable development issues. We only touch upon decarbonization, and we tend to forget about the protection of water, protection of ecosystems onshore, fighting against poverty, and so on. That can lead to disproportions in the economic development of the world that the humanity will face, and the whole world will have to resolve the problems. So in oil and gas industry, some transformations will be required, like the technologies based on methanol, new types of fuel. They help us resolve several problems like decarbonization, protect the ecosystem on shore, and protect the water. Speaking about the Arctic, so for example, the ammonia or methane leakage can lead to problems, and such connections can have such spills can have huge impact on the ecosystem. Then it's necessary to develop fertilizers to fight hunger, and we need to speak about strategic plans, the formation of new energy carriers, which is required to ensure sustainable energy supply, no matter what region we are talking about: China, Russia, Europe, or anything else.
Besides, another important component is that Russia has many areas with low capacities for the use of natural gas. And what is needed for these areas is to use small capacity LNG production technologies and to use it for local storage and local consumption. This is small capacity technologies. This is some kind of local distribution network which generates energy for the local community and thus also generates energy for all industrial needs. Speaking about small-scale capacities, I might show you an example. I couldn't show you these slides yesterday, unfortunately. This year, we launched the project called LNG Map. We basically designed such a map and reference materials where you could find all the information regarding our further development. It is very user-friendly, both for consumers and producers, because you will find information about new opportunities and new emerging markets. As for the climate component, of course, it is vital. I'm not going to go into detail. On this slide, here you can see the opportunities of the Russian LNG, given our geography. Russia enjoys the lowest footprint already today globally. We can reduce our global footprint by replacing LNG, and we might also replace the Australian LNG, sorry to say that.
For our Australian participants to understand what it was all about, the Australia in the next one with the columns. Тот слайд, где была вот эта степень загрязненности следа. Да, вот этот. Just for our Australian participants, I don't think that all of you can read the legend of this slide. Australia here are white columns with the black border. With a black border. And so that's probably why Alexander was commenting in a sense that Australia does not look very well in terms of the cleanness of their product.
And it's normal. And Russian one is green. Естественно, что
It is natural that Russian producers are very active on the market in managing their carbon footprint. This refers to the operational production sites, Yamal and Sakhalin as well. It also covers new projects like Baltic LNG and Yakutsk LNG. We also expect to use floating stations which will generate smooth energy, because we are talking about carbon neutral energy carriers. Speaking about this hydrogen map and the development of this sector, you can see the indicators for 2035, 2 million tons by 2035. I liked the presentation of Roberto when he showed what kind of hydrogen could be produced in Australia and Russia. In Russia, we might use nuclear power and renewables. Unfortunately, renewables are not so widespread in Russia. We can use hydraulic energy and new sources of hydrogen. I mean the capacities of C2 plus production and polyethylene, where hydrogen is a side product and can also be rolled out on the market. Of course, we should not forget about CCS technology for the ammoniac production. And Russia can use its competitive advantage, namely, it can not only use shipping or roads, but also maritime paths to deliver its products. Magadansk, Sakhalin, Chukotka, all these regions have joined their efforts in a joint R&D center. We have a specific project on new energy carriers, Lng Hydrogen cluster, and ammonia center in the Western Yakutia. These are the members of that center. We also, as I said, use nuclear power energy to produce hydrogen. To my mind, in traditional energy carriers and LNG, we are going to be competitors and not partners with Australia, because I believe that our interests differ in terms of exports to China. Friendship is okay, but when we are talking business, we are willing to protect our own interests. But nevertheless, we might join our efforts in some projects like alternative energy carriers, which includes hydrogen and ammonia production with various shipment technologies. SIA might become such a platform to pool the efforts of Russian and Australian producers. Our technological chain for ammonia production, briefly. We use closed reserves in the Western Yakutia. Given the monopolistic role of Gazprom, we can easily find the solutions here and also produce ammoniac fertilizers, which is really important because there are no plants in that region of Russia to produce ammoniac fertilizers. And in conclusion, a few remarks. First, we need to take into account all the SDGs. We might draft our own indicators, which would be mainstreamed with the SDGs. It should cover ecosystems onshore and offshore. We should make the best use of what the Mother Nature had given to us. We need to use it responsibly as infrastructure. We also need to understand that Russia has its benefits owing to its geography. We can use the maritime sea, we can use the North Sea route to organize shipment and sales. We can create new routes. Alternative fuels also ensure the sustainable development of the Arctic. Thus, we have not only environmental solutions, but also have a soft power for the Arctic states, for their policy in the Arctic. The sustainable development is important for us, and we are committed to forge new partnerships in order to come up with specific solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for a very informative presentation and for your very frank appraisal of the current status of the dilemma, competition or cooperation. I think we have time for only one very quick question. No, thank you. Then probably we'll have an opportunity to talk a bit more in the end of our session. Our next speaker is Professor Andrew Garnett. Andrew leads the University of Queensland Centre for Natural Gas. That centre aims to become a leading provider of technical and social science research services in the unconventional gas sector. Andrew is also a non-executive director of NERA and of the Australian Gas Industry Trust and reviewer for the International Energy Agency World Energy Outlook series. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks, Alexei. And thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today. And thanks very much to all the previous speakers for covering most of the material so well. I'll see if I can make up a little bit of time here. I have a few bullet points that Alexei asked me to address, and I'll do a couple of those, and then I'll follow off from the first speaker and maybe say something a little provocative, just because it's late in the day for me and I'm going to go home. It's almost beer o'clock where I'm sitting, and so I will leave you at the end of this and go and hope on a cold one. So I'm sitting here at the University of Queensland, and we do industry applied and government applied research. And as we were speaking, I was reflecting on the other speakers and how things have changed. So the LNG industry here really kicked off less than 10 years ago and rapidly built out 20 million tons plus of LNG exports and an enormous amount of onshore gas infrastructure. Thousands of wells actually have gone down, and still hundreds go down every year. And things have changed. So way back when our first research agendas were about the normal things you would imagine. How do I get more gas out? How to reduce the costs? But all of the social issues were local. They were all about the local communities in which the gas fields operate and the so-called social license to operate issues. And over the last less than 2 years, it's moved to obviously a new label, because if you have a new label, you can sell new services. So it's now ESG, environmental social governance. And what we're seeing now is that the influences on this industry are no longer just local, but actually all around the world. And we're seeing it from both the public narrative, we're seeing it influencing the political sphere. And as I think Andrew, or one of the speakers mentioned, it's also influencing investment and the ability to raise capital. So our agenda on the research side has sort of shifted from some of that more conventional oil and gas stuff you might imagine into the ESG space. And within that, there's a subset called emissions and carbon intensity, which is probably the busiest thing that keeps us awake at night. So I'm just going to repeat what a few people have said. We also see there's no real alternative to long-term use of gas, but those pressures will rise and it will become uninvestable unless decarbonisation not only goes ahead strongly, but is demonstrably and verifiably goes ahead. That starts, of course, with fugitives, but also includes CCS, both of which are areas which we're very busy on. Then we talk about the hydrogen route. Clearly, as many people have said, the easiest way to build hydrogen demand is going to be with the cheapest hydrogen, not with the most expensive hydrogen. So that takes you to the gas blue route. Otherwise, you don't build demand at the frightening numbers which Roberto showed in terms of dollars per kilogram. So you can build demand that way. But there's actually a bit of a human effect going on here, but we're all looking for a magic bullet. So the latest magic bullet is hydrogen. The magic bullet 10 years ago was CCS. And so I think it's worthwhile just reflecting on some of the things that many people have said, is that there isn't a magic bullet. It's not hydrogen. Hydrogen is part of it, but there are many other things that need to be part of it too. And let me explain a little bit about the green hydrogen thing when it comes down to the real local issues that you deal with in Australia. Now, I'm sure green hydrogen will have a place at some stage, but green hydrogen requires a couple of things that we're short of in Australia. One of those is water. Green hydrogen takes water and it pulls it apart and then it exports it. So not only is there a resource conflict for hydrogen because everybody else wants water, there's also going to be a political and social cost to trying to do that too. Now, if you then want to power green hydrogen with renewables, you then need an enormous amount of land if we're doing that with solar PV, which is the predominant source where we sit. And there's an enormous conflict for land. So we have a water energy nexus and we have a land food energy nexus with that particular route. So that's not to say it's not going to be part of it, but it's not going to be the answer. It's just going to be one part of the answer. So it's interesting to sort of reflect on these things before we get a little carried away And I think the number of speakers who've pointed out the fact that the use of gas is going to carry on inevitably. It's just that we're going to have to get better at it. I think that's bang on. Now, one of the things that Alexei did mention on a slightly different subject, he asked me to mention some of the things about the policy settings here in Australia. That's a bit of a tricky subject for us Australians. I had to Google it 5 seconds ago just to make sure I'm still up to date, because we never quite know where it's going. So the Australian government at the moment, I'm just looking to my colleagues there, we don't have a long-term net zero. That's the federal government, don't have a long-term net zero target. But every state and territory does. We're a federal country, and so every state does that. And there's a number of speculations at the moment about whether the current government will come out with a net zero statement. What we have seen is the states are doing it, and we're seeing increasingly, as you've heard from some people around the table today, you've heard that individual companies are doing it anyway. So actually the companies and the organizations and the individual states are actually pushing ahead on various net zero targets. And you can make of that what you like. It certainly should influence some of the ESG pressures, at least in the short term. But then I think I'll mention the last thing, which is the whole idea that what we say we are going to do and what we say we want and what we're actually doing is completely dissonant. So many of you will have seen the IEA's net zero report, which came out, I think, in May this year. And you will have seen a large number of pledges towards net zero, which various companies have made. And then you will see that they're actually disconnected from what's actually happening. So we're in a bit of a strange world in the energy space at the moment, where many of the pledges and many of the things that we say we want are not backed up by what we're seeing on the ground. And what we're trying all to do in a discussion like this is figure out what the future means when the gap between what we say we want and what we actually do seems to me, in any case, to be growing. So I think, having said that, I think the role of gas, and I was very grateful for the previous speaker to mention the SDGs, because it's very easy to forget some of the other human connections we have to make by delivering energy. So the role of gas will be fraught in the decarbonisation story. It has a big role, but we also have to deliver energy to a growing population, and it has to be affordable. And so while we're doing that, it's going to be very messy, it's going to be very contentious, but I think it's still, in the long run, will be a very positive story. So I'm going to leave it there, Alexei. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Do we have any questions? Yes, Vladimir, please, go ahead.
Добрый день, Владимир Боронов.
Good afternoon, Vladimir Boronov. I totally share your view, but here is my question, speaking about hydrogen technologies. By 2050, 80% in the overall energy mix will come from hydrogen. To have a better understanding of this statistical picture, we need to know that overall, over 50% share comes from oil, coal, and gas, and even renewables. So how do you think? Is it really possible? Is it achievable that hydrogen will be a part of that mix and will have such a big share? Or maybe you think that this hype, this buzz about hydrogen will go down, and hydrogen will never be, its share will never be as big as that of other fuels.
Oh, thank you for the question. I think it's worthwhile stepping back a little bit and thinking about what 2050 looks like. So just after 2050, there's going to be 10 billion people on the planet. Just after that. And they're all going to want to live to a similar level of energy use, or at least wealth, that we're currently living. So the answer to your question about how much hydrogen is used, and particularly its market share, is as much about what we think total primary energy demand is going to be. So most of the scenarios which end up with more and more decarbonisation, or greening, if you like, end up with us somehow managing to level off our total primary energy demand. Now, we've never done that, so there are countries that have done it through efficiency measures, and there's countries who've reduced energy per capita largely through offshoring manufacturing when you look deeply. But it's difficult to see how you supply energy for 10 billion people with increasingly middle-class aspirations with the current technologies that we have available to us. So then you said, I think something like 80% would be hydrogen in 2050. I can't see how you do that. So when I look at supply chains for gas, if it's gas to hydrogen, or for coal, possibly, I haven't really looked at that too much. But I can't see how the 80%. Now, that's not to say that hydrogen as a fuel source in 2050 isn't important, but to think of it being 80%, which is the total fossil fuel market share today, would seem to me not to be realistic. Or let me say another way, I'd be very interested if you could come up with a realistic scenario that delivers 80% hydrogen by 2050.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Any more questions? No, okay. In that case, we will move to our next speaker. Vladimir Boronov is the member of the board of the National Association of Liquefied Natural Gas and head of the Hydrogen Energy Program and associate professor at the Faculty of Energy and Environmental Technologies at Itmore University. And Itmore is based in St. Petersburg, right? Университет Itmore.
St. Petersburg, Itmore, yeah.
Please, пожалуйста, вам слово.
Could you show my slides, please? So at the beginning, I would like to tell you that I listened attentively to the speakers yesterday and today, and I wanted to give you some arguments. I came to the opinion that as far as the forecast for hydrogen is concerned, people think differently about it. And now I'd like to show you my presentation, solid step of liquid gas or heavy burden of light hydrogen. They sometimes have several misbeliefs, and they compare hydrogen with sex industry worker, which turns where it is more profitable. But as a scientist, I would like to take technical characteristics as a basis. If you compare liquefied natural gas, it's the certain state of natural gas. If you compare it with hydrogen, then on the basis of the parameters, you can draw several scenarios. Of course, that's my personal opinion, and it's not related to the position of the companies where I worked before. But you can see how different the opinion can be. Sometimes colleagues say, we can have certain phases or stages in the strategy of hydrogen development, 2020, 2030, 2035, and so on. If you have a look at the forecasts made 10 or 15 years ago, like the forecast by ExxonMobil, in 2007, the indicators are completely different, even for coal. I asked you a question about the energy mix, and the percentage of hydrogen is so small, we tend to forget about oil and coal. Russia exports and supplies oil, gas, and coal actively. Australia also actively exports coal. So let me show you some criteria. The criteria number one is geography, and today I'm going to speak about Russia and how technical experts work with two energy sources. You can speak about policy, You can speak about prices, but you can also speak about regulations, properties, means of extractions, and properties and characteristics. And so first, I would like to divide between hydrogen and LNG, just for us to have better understanding of what is going to score more. And I will give either pluses or minuses, and you can, on the basis of scores, calculate what advantages hydrogen and LNG have. Here you can see some regulations listed, not all of them, of course, but as far as LNG is concerned, Russia is at the stage of development. About 100 different standards will be approved by 2035. A lot of aspects are not completely agreed upon. We see a number of problems with the LNG, how to cross the border, how to register the deliveries, and so on. For hydrogen, we have regulations related to industrial use in gas industry, metal industry, chemical industry, so for chemical purposes. But to speak about the export of hydrogen or energy market for hydrogen is too early. There are some new notions that we call hydrogen energy, for example, but a lot of colleagues say that there's hydrogen economy and hydrogen technologies. Hydrogen economy is not formed in the world yet. So Russia has certain strategies for hydrogen development, and you can see them on the slide right now. Just for our colleagues from Australia, I can tell you that these are energy strategy of Russia, roadmap of Russia, concept for the development of hydrogen energy. The Russian government is interested in the development of hydrogen. We understand that if we do not deal with it right now, we will lag behind other countries, so we have to act really quickly. Just for you to better understand everything which is related to a small tonnage LNG is developing, but it's developing quite slowly. It has been developing for 10 years, but still we lack certain regulations and technologies. Properties, we say let's extract it and store it, but let's not forget about the properties of hydrogen. And the temperature of liquefaction for hydrogen is not far from absolute zero. The limit is about 19 degrees, and even if you try to keep it in that interval, you can either go to solid state or it looks like snow in solid state. And there are a lot of other chemical properties related to hydrogen. I don't want to go into details today, but you have to understand that in regular gas state, 70% is hydrogen, but if you liquefy it, then 100% or 99% of it is the para-hydrogen. And I wanted to show you some other parameters, like density, for example. It's different from LNG. And here you can also see such a parameter as flammability limit. This is class 1 of danger. It is the most dangerous element if you combine it with, for example, chlorine or with fluorine. It all depends on this mixture or on the light, and it can turn into a flame. I just wanted to show you different parameters for different states of hydrogen. So here you can see the pressure, 250 for LNG. If you liquefy it, then the gas decreases in volume, but for hydrogen, it's completely different. It doesn't play such a big role. If you take, for example, reservoirs for hydrogen, you need to have a high pressure, about 70 megapascal. If you speak about a liquefied state, then the difference between the pressure will not be so different, but the energy intensity is different. So here I just wanted to show you the ratio between the volume of gas and the liquid. If you raise the temperature higher than a critical temperature, no matter how you press it, no matter what pressure you use, it will turn into a gas state. And now energy intensity. So this is the main factor to use hydrogen as energy carrier and fuel, but I already told you about its danger. And I think that the most important indicator here is the percentage of flammability depending on the concentration in the air. If you speak about natural gas, then the percentage of flammability is from 4 to 15%, depending on the composition in LNG. But in hydrogen, have a look at it. It's from 4 to 75% in the air, and from 4 to 96% for oxygen. It's the kind of a mixture that can that is really easily inflammable. It's a detonating gas, and it means that the static tension can lead, which you have on your clothes, for example, can lead to a flame or bursting of hydrogen. You can see different parameters here that on the basis of that you can understand it's a dangerous kind of fuel. Then the color of flame, well, sometimes they say it doesn't matter. The natural gas has blue flame and almost white or translucent flame. Of hydrogen flame, we add adherents to the natural gas to see its leakage. And what can we do about hydrogen if we even do not see how it burns? Then they speak about diffusivity and about volatility. They say that it can be easily destroyed in the area of joints between formation, but other scientists say that there's one molecular hydrogen, and they can be different. Plus, they also speak about reactivity of hydrogen. So the field for further development of technologies is really huge, especially for technical aspects working in this area. So cryogen temperature for natural gas is of course, a certain danger for the use of natural gas, but it's a bit lower than for hydrogen. So when we speak about natural gas or LNG, we say that it's a dangerous product, but in comparison to hydrogen, the group of risk is different. It is the fourth risk group, whereas the hydrogen is a detonating gas. Both of them are volatile gases, and sometimes the producers of cars say that if there's any breakage in the car, then the gas can simply be volatile and fly away without the creation of a dangerous mixture. But the liquefied natural gas and hydrogen can have sediments, and you know that all the explosions and incidents that happened in the nearest past were related to the mixture of methane and propane when they were located in underground facilities, for example. So there are different methods to receive LNG and hydrogen. I just wanted to tell you that technologies become better and better. We try to decrease the cost of production. You can see the figures on the slide, and there are certain ranges. So there are pyrolysis methods, and if you combine it with capture and storage, then this technology will be cheap. Electrolysis technologies also improve. As we know, there are different ways to perform electrolysis on the basis of membrane, for example.
Running out of time, can you possibly move closer to the conclusions?
Понял.
I would like to tell you briefly about the transportation and storage. So for liquefied natural gas, it has specific characteristics. It's a big topic. I will continue to give pluses and minuses, so you can see all the scores there. If it's a plus and minus, it means that it is 0.5% as far as usage is concerned. Then hydrogen has more benefits, but don't forget that you need to gasify it to use it in chemical industry as fuel and so on. And hydrogen, especially if it is liquefied, can be used for different purposes, for different industries. And there's a separate topic, electro generation, when you use semiconductors to produce energy for different cars, for example. Then infrastructure, the territory of many countries, and the leaders here are Japan, Korea, Germany, and a number of other countries. As far as the infrastructure for LNG is concerned, they have necessary technologies, both for LNG and hydrogen, but have a look at the forecast for Japan and Germany. The number of gas stations for LNG will grow, and you compare it with the process which is going a little bit faster for electric cars, and we have also plans for hydrogen stations. But here in Russia, I cannot give you a lot of scores for hydrogen because they're far away from being perfect. Technologies for hydrogen and LNG. You have to divide the technologies into what we already have, what needs adaptation, and further improvement. Then cost. We spoke a lot about the cost of LNG and hydrogen. I will not cover it in details. You just have to understand how hydrogen is a derivative. And even today, for the technologies to develop further on, for the hydrogen to enter the market, you need huge subsidies, and that already happens in Japan, in Germany, and other European countries, in Australia as well. Yes, subsidies are allocated for the development of technologies. There are a lot of grants, even here in Russia, for the development of hydrogen technologies, and definitely such areas require state support. We understand that political factors play a significant role. Russia and Australia are both suppliers of energy carriers, so there can be a certain regulation based on pricing. It's ongoing right now. Now I move on to my summary. Here are the consequences. I spoke about technologies for development and forecasts. So we have a certain forecast for the development of natural gas till 2030. And I'm sure that gas and liquefied natural gas technologies will continue to develop. For hydrogen, the growth will be observed, but it will be not so high because investment will finish, technologies will develop, find their niche, and without support and benefits, subsidies, that market would not be there at all. Hydrogen energy, well, it's a kind of a term which is too early to say, and we have not yet reached the state of hydrogen energy or economy. In my university, ITMO, we work a lot with LNG and hydrogen technologies, and we even train experts for hydrogen energy. They are very important. There are master degree programs for hydrogen and LNG. Well, it's hard for me to say if it's well developed in Australia or not, but in Russia it's not not so well developed. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for taking so much time.
Presentation, but yes, you have overconsumed time, so being aware of the fact that it's 8 p.m., quarter past 8 in the evening in Canberra, where Peter Moore is, and the same time in Brisbane, I don't want to disadvantage our last speaker, Sergei Ivanov, in the sense that I would like our Australian participants to listen to his presentation before they go to bed. So if possible, we will take questions for both Vladimir and Sergei after Sergei's presentation. Sergei Ivanov is Executive Director of LNG Association of Russian Federation. Welcome, Sergei. Добро пожаловать, вам слово.
Да, спасибо большое, Алексей. Спасибо большое.
Thank you, Alexei. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to give a presentation, to say a few words about our association. I will try to be very brief and speak about applied aspects of our work. We didn't say where we heard a little bit about prospects of our cooperation. I would like to say, to add up a few comments on that. Our association's project is to create a product to assess investments into LNG projects for small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, which are not, for some reason, part of Gazprom. Of course, they do have their own R&D capacities, but I think we all are aware of the fact that sometimes you need to have a quick and rapid assessment of your investment. That is why we created our calculator, Lng Investment Calculator. Within a year, we have been working, collecting data across the country. These are the main data: gas composition, cost of lands, lots, cost of energy. All in all, we have approximately 10 indicators. Taken all together, they allow us to collect data on the investment rate. So when you go to our website, that is what you see. You choose the production capacities of your plant, the region, and at the end, you see this information. This calculator is free of charge. This is some kind of demo version, so everyone can go online and see it and see whether the investment into this particular project is cost-effective or not. We compared our calculator with existing products of other companies, our partners. We're handy here. We do understand that overall investment depends on each individual project. So we take all the additional factors for an individual project. According to our assessments, usually it takes 6 months. For us, it takes only 10 days to come up with a complete analysis. Our calculator has already become an independent intellectual product which keeps revamping and reloading. So we have the chain: production, transportation, and consumption, and our calculator is able to calculate not only costs for a construction of a production plant, but also the costs, the transportation costs for LNG to a particular point which you indicate on the map. You can choose shipping or onshore deliveries. We also have the consumption chapter, consumption block, where you can calculate investments for conventional fuels and your conversion to LNG and conversion costs. Previous speakers said that LNG is highly relevant today. The market is in the making. And we believe that those who will come into the market at the end of the day will end up building it. Here is the LNG map of the Russian Federation, which was presented to you earlier. Many projects which are in the pipeline today had been designed with the use of our calculator. Basically, this is it. If there are questions, I will be happy to take them. Otherwise, I'm always at your disposal. You will see my contact information here.
Australian participants, even those who are on the East Coast, are still there, not asleep. So now we can get, if we could get any questions, some questions to either Vladimir or Sergey. Nothing from the room. Dear Australian participants, do you have any questions to our last two speakers?
Sure. Alexei, hi, I'm Roberto. I'm wondering, can somebody give an overview of what the focus really is for Russia in terms of hydrogen? Is it green, or are they going to use their vast gas resources, or nuclear, or all of the above?
Well, who is brave enough?
Алексей, если можно, да?
Yeah.
You know, the situation is that quite a few avenues are being developed, and in our association we believe that scientific solutions are the future. You cannot say that LNG is a silver bullet here for all the regions. You cannot use only hydrogen or only renewables. Russia adopted a number of roadmaps and decrees, for instance, those related to developing LNG and conversion of urban vehicles to CNG or LNG. But at the same time, we are also actively engaged in developing hydrogen technologies. Unfortunately, as of today, I can't say that hydrogen projects are very active in practical terms, but they will be there, and currently we need to make many changes, inter alia some legal changes to move forward. Anyway, I would say that currently we are more focused on natural gas. I will make another comment. Roberto, in your presentation, you said that Australia is a leading LNG producer, and I would like to add here something. We have strategic LNG development strategy for Russia, and 140 million tons a year for LNG. Of course, we are being optimistic here. We have 80 million tons a year. This is more realistic, but my question is whether we will be able to be in top 3. But as you see, that proves that we are mostly focusing on LNG. Besides, we have other big companies like Rosatom, so I think that we will also focus on nuclear energy, and we will also have some other companies who are going to develop actively hydrogen technologies. As Sergey just said, our energy strategy defines a role for each and every energy source.
Any more questions to either Vladimir or Sergey from Australian side?
Suppose one from me.
Peter, is this
Do
you?
the Russian companies feel that they need to be selling net zero LNG internationally anytime in the future.
Давайте я тогда отвечу.
I'll take the question. As of today, 3 loads of carbon-neutral LNGs were completed in Sakhalin 2 and 1 from Yamal LNG. LNG producers were Russian production plants, but in order to ensure carbon neutrality, all the loadings were made outside the Russian Federation. So I would say that this is rather a prospect for a future for the Russian Federation. We recently held the forum on oil and gas in Sakhalin, and an agreement was signed to continue carbon-neutral LNG within the Sakhalin 2 project. As for Russian strategy in this regard, on one of my slides I show you that we have the environmentally friendly LNG. This is our program, and I believe that Shell here is our main partner. Yamal LNG project benefits from a wide range of tools, including not only CCS technologies, but also the use of methane hydrogen mix for compressors, then production of non-carbon ammonia, and of course the greenhouse gas emission management system, which was designed by the Yamal LNG project. This is also instrumental in reducing carbon footprint in LNG. Just one comment, if I may. The recent news is that Yamal LNG plans to also produce hydrogen. It also puts us on the decarbonization path. So Gazprom and Shell are both involved, as well as Total and Novatek in Yamal LNG. Rosneft and British Petroleum are very active here. Everything is designed to reduce carbon footprint, and of course, Russia is still committed to all those projects.
Any more questions for Sergey or Vladimir, Andrew Garnett, Andrew McConville, Peter Moore? Anything from you?
I don't have anything else.
No, doesn't look like that you are eager to ask any more questions. I fully appreciate that it's late in Australia, so probably moving to the closing part of our roundtable today. We can, well, before we go, if there is a desire to have some kind of a general discussion, there were some questions from our listeners who were watching and listening to us via YouTube broadcast. Some of them were anonymous and some of them were not anonymous. And so I will ask some of those questions. The next 2 or 3 come from Angela MacDonald-Smith, who is the senior resources writer for the Australian Financial Review newspaper. And these are questions to our Russian participants. The first question was, is the Russian government or industry exploring potential cooperation in clean hydrogen in any way, given Australia's potential to supply the fuel? Кто-нибудь из российских наших участников готов будет ответить Анджеле?
Ну, давайте я немножечко попробую, хотя...
I'll try to answer, but I think that those who are involved in analytics will be better fitted for this question. Well, if we're talking about hydrogen production, as I said previously, Russian companies rather focus on hydrogen production from LNG. So by this I mean blue hydrogen or pyrolysis produced hydrogen, and at the end we will have clean hydrogen. Many experts disagree with that concept, with those targets being set for the industry, but they are there, and we do understand that we will still have to move from LNG experts to hydrogen experts. Speaking about electrolysis, produced hydrogen, so-called green hydrogen using renewables. So these kind of projects do exist in Russia, but they are not economically, they're not cost efficient yet, and they are not Russian customer oriented yet. And then the use of nuclear energy, which is not always considered as environmentally friendly. So nuclear energy is also engaged. Today I was in Rosatom, where this point is on the agenda. Alexander Klementiev, a few words about a few practical aspects. The Australian company Future Industries, which participated in St. Petersburg Economic Forum, announced that they are going to partner with Russian companies for hydrogen production. I know for sure that they had detailed meetings in Russian regions, for instance in Yakutia, where the delegation came for visit. We are more focused. They are more focused on green hydrogen. In the Russian case, these are hydraulic stations, hydraulic plants. During the recent meeting in Scarborough, the topic was reason about which color of hydrogen is better. And our Japanese colleagues gave a very simple question. The color of hydrogen does not matter. What matters is to meet consumers' demands and to meet environmental requirements. So it's not the source of hydrogen that matters, but rather its footprint and its viability. Of course, both Russia and Australia have an immense potential to exchange their technologies, their midstream technologies, and conversion technologies. But I think what is needed here is to communicate more. And I believe that in the frame of this Russia-Australian dialogue, we will be able to find our common denominator.
A few questions more, and the next one I would probably address to our Australian participants, again hoping that you are still not asleep. The question was brought up in the other session yesterday, that same session which I mentioned to some of you at the beginning of today's roundtable, the session which was dedicated to Russia's place in the global hydrogen market. Actually, it was not a question, it was a comment, and I would like to hear some co-comment or counter-comment. The comment went to say hydrogen export to Asia Pacific from Australia will not be compatible, will not be able to compete with the Russian export because of the distance factor. And that resonates with some ideas which were voiced yesterday by Igor Radichkin, who is still here in the room today, when he was saying, it was new to me, sorry, I was quite ignorant in that regard. He was saying that the main thing is not the production of hydrogen, the main difficulty is transportation and the economics of the transportation. So, dear Australian participants, can you comment or counter-comment on all this? Thank you.
I could have a start.
Thank you, Andrew. Please do.
On a more general comment, I think, than the competition between Russian hydrogen exports and Australian hydrogen exports. So I think it depends, right, on whether you think there's going to be a strong climate-driven demand for hydrogen, in which case there will be more demand than supply, or whether you think it's going to be just a straightforward price competition for hydrogen. And so I think in order to answer the question about the competitiveness, you really have to think about the demand situation for hydrogen. And to think about that, you have to think about what is the likelihood that the world starts to take these pledges seriously and therefore demand more hydrogen for climate reasons. So I know it doesn't quite answer the question, but I think the question's really one which is embedded in what does the future energy demand look like and why?
Yeah, I'd probably add that it's a complicated answer because transport is one cost, but the cost of producing the hydrogen is at the moment a major one. And I think the third element is just how clean people want it to be and how much they're going to impose a cost or a desirability on its cleanliness. And it's the interaction of those three factors that really is going to determine it.
Well, just maybe I can add to that, Peter. It's possible, therefore, that the competitive edge is the cleanliness or the emissions intensity, rather than straightforward the cost. Effectively, that's the sort of derivative of what you're saying there, which is essentially the buying market putting a price on carbon one way or another through preferring one set of emissions intensity over another, which would be a nice development.
Okay.
And there are things that Australia can do. For example, if you take the Tasmanian situation where they're running hydro all the time, they can run electrolysers flat out 24/7. They produce green electricity, so they produce green hydrogen, and they're doing it without having to bury any emissions. If they turn it into ammonia, which they intend to do, you don't have to liquefy it, you don't have to pay those large costs, you don't have to have special ships. And then if the Japanese and the Koreans can get to the point where they can run pure ammonia in their plants and in their ships, and if you can build an ammonia ship that actually burns its own fuel to get there, to drive down the cost of the transport, then there's all sorts of those permutations that still have to come. And you can see how this might play out in various different ways.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question from that same Angela MacDonald-Smith, and it's addressed to our Russian participants. Might there be some alliances that emerge in terms of hydrogen technology or project development? I think she means, of course, alliances between Australia and Russia.
Давайте я еще раз тогда отвечу. Александр Клементьев.
My name is Alexander, and I would like to answer. So, such alliances are, of course, possible. The main question is to determine the subject and the participants. I told you that we have a research and educational center and a number of projects where the hydrogen technologies are involved. And such technologies are not only for the purpose of export, so to satisfy the needs of customers outside of our country. They're first of all aimed at the satisfaction of the entities and companies which are members of our research and educational center. You know that we here in Russia have vast territory, a lot of settlements which are not connected to the electric grids. So the question of energy supply, sustainability and resilience is still big in many regions of Russia. It's a relevant question, and you cannot monetize it traditionally because it's under the threat of the consequences of energy transition. And we can speak directly here about coal industry. In such districts, alliances are possible, and our goals, as I believe, are the same as the goals of Australian companies. So there's a basis or foundation for such alliances, but we need to communicate and meet more. We need to have a look at practical examples, namely how we can take our opportunities and transform them into actual steps or projects either here in Russia or in Australia, because technological solutions available in the Russian companies are not they can be used in different countries of the world. They have good commercial potential. They can be used in Russia and in Australia.
Specifically, thank you for mentioning that Sever Center. We will certainly keep that Sever Center, Nord Center, on the radar screen of the Australia-Russia dialogue, because my feeling at the moment is that we are probably ready to move this dialogue from just the general conversations like this and presentations, which are useful, and Australia-Russia dialogue is happy to maintain that channel of communication, but probably we need to move to a stage where we will have a more if you wish, a narrower circle discussions with the experts and representatives of petroleum companies and companies who are in the hydrogen production business or mood to produce the hydrogen. We should probably move to that style of events rather than meetings like today's round table. Well, I guess I don't have any further questions, and anybody from the Russian side, maybe some general comments? Did you find it useful, the session generally? Or our Australian participants, do you want to make any general comment in terms of where to next? And I think that I certainly have noted a few things which require further development. I'm very happy that that concept of competition not necessarily being the enemy of cooperation was voiced. It encourages me and gives me a stimulus to further design and organize events like today's one on the Australia-Russia dialogue platform, but also, as I said before, to try to do more specific events for experts and petroleum companies from both sides. So, dear Australian participants, does anyone want to make any general comment in the end before we wave goodbye to each other?
I would just make one, and I think that relates to, if you're talking about hydrogen and people in Australia, one of the ways we're now organised is to have the various hydrogen hubs. And I've lost count of how many there are. I think there's a dozen or more. But on each of those hubs, there is a coordinator and there is a committee, and they do communicate with each other across the nation. So if you're looking for some degree of organisation around, who's involved and who's doing what, that is an organisation. And of course, once you get into the universities, you've got people like ALF here, but you've also got the CRCs. So there's a series of organisations, that focus people's attention and you can work through, I think.
So, Peter, do you think that we are actually ready to link, I don't know, for example, Skolkovo Energy Center and or that Center Sever, which was mentioned earlier, to link them directly to some of those hubs or CRCs in Australia, and for the Australia-Russia dialogue to kind of withdraw and rely on them, that they will be able to do better because they are obviously more qualified professionals in these areas?
Well, I'm just saying that they're a contact within Australia. If you still need to provide the link, yes. I don't think anyone else has got the level of linkage that you do through the ARD, yes. and Christo, to link the two countries together. Right. If you're looking at cooperation there. But what I'm saying is that within Australia sometimes, and within any of these countries, you have to hunt around for who do I actually talk to. Whereas I think the hydrogen industry in Australia is getting relatively organised around some of these hubs, and there are some key people there.
Okay, all right. Roberto, may I ask you the same question? Will you be prepared? Will any group at the current university be prepared to be linked, married, if you wish, to Russian counterparts and to deal with them directly without ARD interference? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, of course. The university places great importance on external engagements and partnerships with academia around the world, with industry, with government. So we'd be fully supportive.
Very good, very good. Andrew McConville, George Gilboy has left us, so may I ask you to comment on not so much on the research part or research cooperation in this area, but in terms of building better connections between the actual producers. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think it's probably more in the research development phase at the present point in time. What I was thinking about was the Future Energy Exports CRC here in Australia. I think would be a very good avenue for sort of early stage engagement. The only other point I'd make is, it is worth watching in terms of my membership. There are different levels of investment and engagement. Woodside is certainly investing heavily in this space. Some others are more investing in the CCS space. I would think that on a commercial venture scale, there would be openness to have that conversation. Our industry has grown up on joint ventures, so these are things that we are very familiar with, and the sorts of scale and capital investment required to develop, whether it be hydrogen or hydrogen and CCS, is very, very significant. So I would think that people would be looking for commercial partners that have strong global balance sheets. So in that sense, it is definitely worth watching. The only other comment I'd make, Alexei, and I think it goes to Andrew Garnett's point, the time taken to develop these industries, I think, yes, there is a lot of momentum and it is moving very fast, but it will still take time. And I think, there is opportunity at the formulating stages to still be involved. It's not something that's going to go from 0 to 100 straight away. And so I think there is time. I think there's still work to be done on the role of government and the policy frameworks that support it. Those things are going to be very important, as well as the general investment environment. And keeping in mind that the investment environment in Australia at the moment is probably a little bit more challenging. It's a little bit more restrictive given the impact of COVID at the present point in time. So, you know, I think there's probably some work to be done, but you know, as an industry association, we too are always available to make linkages between companies that want to potentially invest into Australia and existing players in the market. You know, we're also available to make those connections as needs be and to help advise on the policy environment as it stands or as it may evolve.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. And in terms of association-to-association connections, I think that at this stage I am reasonably happy because of this connection between association, which you are the Chief Executive Officer of APA, Petroleum Production Exploration Association and Australia-Russia Dialogue. But if we talk about company-to-company relations, of course I'm very happy that we managed to get a very senior representative from Woodside participating today. We also invited Santos representatives, but unfortunately they could not be here, but still I have certain contacts there and I will follow up with them. Apart from Woodside and Santos, leave universities and research centers aside for a moment, specifically in the company sector, who else should we be trying to attract to this dialogue?
Yeah, look, it's a very interesting question, Alexei, and I think, I mean, some of it's hard to know because, you know, these things do remain commercial. Woodside and Santos, the large Australian companies that have indicated interests in CCS and hydrogen. But, you know, a number of our members, smaller companies like Cooper and Beach, moving down a net zero path and also being carbon neutral in their production. So that would suggest that they are exploring options in relation to their own operations. So, you know, I think the appetite is reasonable across the industry. I think, you know, if you're thinking about Australia, the only thing I would say is that the dialogue with the Australian companies, if one is looking to some of the larger global players like Shell or Chevron or Exxon that have a significant presence in Australia, those conversations are probably more effectively had in the context of what their global aspirations are and therefore their global head office conversations, whereas you would tend to focus here into Australia, into the Australian companies. So as I say, the Woodsides, the Santos, Beach, you know, small and mid-tier players, Cemex and others that are wanting to expand their presence here in Australia and be able to provide you know, a low emissions option for energy supply into Australia, or a low emissions option into exporting that energy into Asia, whether it be carbon neutral cargoes of LNG or longer term, whether that be into the hydrogen space as well. So I think if companies were thinking about Australia and participation in Australia, then my first thought would be to focus on the Australian companies rather than say what the global majors are doing in Australia.
All right, okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Peter Moore, I understand you are the non-executive director of both Beach and Carnarvon Petroleum. What are your thoughts on about attracting the smaller companies, not the big ones like Woodside and Santos, to any involvement in the hydrogen LNG with Russian partners?
When you take Carnarvon, their focus is not on LNG. They're currently not a producer. They're not a gas producer. What they have done in terms of making their net zero pledge is to invest in renewable diesel using biodiesel. So quite a different orientation. Their focus is to try and decarbonize their oil as they work with Santos to develop a new oil field. With Beach, of course, they are a joint venture partner with Santos in the Cooper Basin, where a 1.7 million tonne per annum CCS project is being developed, but that has been operated by Santos, so they are the best company to deal with there. You always deal with the operator.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You know, again, you're pretty well covered there. The only other comment I would make is that Beach is about to will become eventually a LNG company in its own right, in the sense that it is a partner, not the operator. Mitsui is the operator of Waitsia onshore gas field, and that gas will go into the Northwest Shelf and be turned into LNG. However, again, it means that Beach, that operation is not actually an LNG producer, because it is the Northwest Shelf that turned the gas into LNG. They simply supply the gas and then pick it up at the other end and then market it. So the LNG technology still exists and stays with the Northwest Shelf venture.
Thank you very much, Peter. Any other comments from the Russian participants? No. I think in that case, I will bring this to the conclusion. Thank you very much to all of you who participated. Just a brief one exchange. When was the last time when you, Andrew Garnett, were in St. Petersburg?
I can't remember. Long time ago. 2001 maybe. 2000.
All right, noted. Andrew doesn't even remember. Andrew McInville, I'm pretty sure we discussed this before, and you said that 2017 was your last visit to St. Petersburg, right?
2017 it was indeed, Alexei, for the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Yes, indeed.
Perfect, thank
But
you.
in another industry, in agriculture, not oil and gas.
All right, okay, thank you. Roberto, when was your last time in St. Petersburg?
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Was that for me? I should just say I did travel throughout Russia during the World Cup 2018, and but St. Petersburg I was there in 2017.
17, very good. Peter Moore, I think we both know that we both were here last time before this, my visit in 2018. Is that right?
Correct.
Correct. Very good. So I'm bringing this up obviously with the hope that we will see all of you at the next St. Petersburg International Guest Forum in 2022, if not earlier. And also, Andrew McInville, I would like to mention, I probably should not be doing this, but I could not really avoid a temptation. I have already promoted the API Conference 2022 to all people who are here in the room, and I will keep doing this with the hope that more Russian companies will come to Brisbane next year. Very good. Thank you very much, and goodbye.